We might make a start. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us in the next in our series of webinars with Vicsport and Volunteering Vic working together. My name is Lisa Hasker. I'm the CEO of Vicsport. Got some of my team in the background. It's great to see some familiar faces on the call. Welcome, everybody. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting and pay my respects to elders past and present. We are recording this session. You will probably seen something pop up on your screen just so that people that miss out can listen to the session afterwards. We've been having an exciting time working with Volunteering Vic on this project supporting sport volunteers. As you all know, volunteers are the lifeblood of sport. Without them, our clubs don't exist, and we need them to continue to provide great sporting opportunities for people of all ages and all abilities and all backgrounds. So it's exciting to be able to provide these sessions and the resources that are on the Volunteering Vic website to help you get more volunteers, select them well, which we're talking about today, supporting them, engaging them, educating them and rewarding them along the way so that we keep getting volunteers into our sports. And with 100 days out from the Paralympic Games, it's an exciting day to be chatting about sport and the people that support sport. But really exciting to have Elle Steele on the call to start us off before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we can do to support volunteers. I've known Elle for a long time. I look not as well, I probably look old, but I am old compared to Elle. I was teaching at a school where Elle was a student in both our past lives, and Elle then went on to become a Paralympic swimming champion, also a champion of wheelchair rugby, which has the nickname Murder Ball. And if you ever get a chance to have a look at wheelchair rugby or Murder Ball on YouTube, you will understand that Elle is a very tough athlete. It is an amazingly robust sport and amazing to watch and be a part of. And we're welcoming Elle to talk to us about how volunteers have supported her in her fantastic elite sporting career through Paralympic swimming and Murder Ball. So welcome, Elle. Give us some insights into what volunteers have helped you along the way, and then we'll have a bit of a chance for questions. And then after that, we're going to go over to Sarah Sterling from Volunteering Vic to take us through some of the information about volunteering. Thanks, Elle.
Thank you so much for having me. It's when I got your email, I was really excited to kind of think back into, because I've been around for so long, back to the day of all of those incredible volunteers that really assisted me in becoming a Paralympian. So my first foray in national swimming was in 1995. At my first junior nationals, I was 11 years old, and we flew up to Sydney with a team of other athletes with disabilities, kids with disabilities under 18, and we partook in a mini Paralympics. For the most part, most of the staff on that team were volunteers. So our carers, the officials, the different administrative people that worked, that made that event happen. But as my career kind of moved more into elite sport, and the idea of disability sport changed, we then moved into a space of multidisability, which meant that at individual or at able-bodied events, Paralympic athletes could swim and race against other people with disabilities in these events called multidisability, and whoever was closest to their world record would win the medal. And the Wheelchair Sports Australia, which was what it was called back in the day, educated the volunteers that were on deck with every other swimmer at every other competition, on what our classifications were, what our needs were, how long it would take us to get in and out of the water, and I'll never forget that these athletes as swimmers, as young children, and as we became kind of, young adults, we really had these beautiful relationships with these volunteers. They knew who we were. They knew when we swam, the times that we wanted to swim, and swim from the times that, would get us on the team or not. They became our family. And so I feel like volunteers, and I know even from a sense of my mum doing a lot of the volunteering in disability sport, because back in the day there was no money to support disability sport. it wouldn't have happened, and my career wouldn't have happened without volunteers. There's a particular volunteer that really changed my life, and he was a nurse from the Children's Hospital that would come to a lot of the junior national camps and events with us. And then later in my life, he was the nurse and our support worker that came along and travelled all the way around Australia with the rugby team, the national rugby team. And this person is not only really exceptional at their job, but also an exceptional human that came into a space of non-judgment, that just saw us as whole human beings and that were doing incredible things in sport. And I think that you need to be a particular kind of person to be an exceptional volunteer. It's a really kind of human-centered activity, and this particular volunteer really changed my life because I basically grew up with him. So I'm really grateful for the relationships and the experiences I've had with these different volunteers, and it's made it so that I have become a more well-rounded athlete and human, because you begin to create relationships with people that you would have not necessarily made relationships with before. Another set of volunteers that really kind of ring true in my heart is, and I can't remember their names, but a lot of people probably know who they are. There were some twins that would sit on pool deck with us at nationals and states and Decembers, and these two sisters that were at every competition, these twins that were there to support only the disabled athletes, there to get our classification in and get us into the marshalling area and get us on deck and make sure that the officials knew that we needed more time to get in and out of the water. So, I really feel that my experiences have been shaped a lot by people that have wanted the best for people with disabilities and wanted us to have the experience like other able-bodied athletes would have had, that we may not necessarily have had if it wasn't for volunteers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Elle. It's interesting that you remember those people so fondly. And just before we say goodbye to Elle, if anyone's got any questions for Elle before we go, I can always send questions to Elle afterwards. But if you've got any that you think of right now, you might want to pop them in the chat before we switch over to Sarah for our session. But thank you, Elle. It is interesting that you remember specific people. It's also interesting that some of those people had kind of volunteered for so long that they followed you from being a small child right through to your adult Paralympic swimming career, and then came into and then others in wheelchair rugby. Because I know from watching swimming meets, there's a lot of volunteers, and I know from wheelchair rugby that there's a lot of volunteers that need quite specialist skills in terms of the kind of engineering, mechanical fixing chairs smash into each other. It's not just a scoring on the sideline role. There's a lot of different things that are needed. So we need all those kind of people. We've got some comments from Megan saying, amazing, what a beautiful story. Thanks for sharing, Elle. Thanks, from Regional Sport Vic. If anyone has any questions before Elle runs off and does the 50 million things that she does in her day, supporting disability sport, but disability advocacy in general, Elle, it's fantastic to see you again. And I will be seeing you again soon. If there's no specific question, thanks, Elle. Oh, here you go. There's a question from Annabelle. Thanks, Elle. Do you think there's a training or mentoring experience that may assist volunteers to give them confidence to work with children or adults with a disability? We've got the right person to answer that question.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I've just been running a program called Building Inclusive Sporting Clubs. And it's been focused on the officials or people that work within the sporting clubs and the volunteers there. It finishes in June, but what we're actually starting to do is build a module that will be written by the facilitators and gather with all the information that we've gathered over the last kind of, I think it's about 14 or 15 months of the project. And that will be housed, I think, or I hope, on Disability Sport Australia's website. So that what we're really trying to do with that module is to come at it from the modernized view of disability, and not the view of people with disabilities or kids with disabilities needing to be rescued or kind of guided into what it is that they need to do, but more from the person with the disability being the guide, this disability centric kind of training, and the language that we're using, it comes from us and we make the decisions, and it kind of is a more modernized idea of disability, which is really exciting. So watch this space. We're hoping that we're building it at the moment. We're hoping it'll be out by the end of June or early July. So there's much more confident, much more content and opportunities for different mentoring experiences as well. And there's also, like, there's so many of us out there that do peer visits or coaching and support work, mentoring for clubs out there. If you put that question out onto LinkedIn, posing a sport, I'm a sporting club, or we're looking at, I work in sport, looking for a mentorship in terms of disability communication or ways to work with people with disabilities, there would be probably 100 people that will respond to you. So there's a real market for that at the moment, as we move into a much more refined idea of what disability, of how disability can be inclusive and accessible for everyone.
Fantastic. Thanks, Elle. And certainly, yes, Sally and everyone on the call will certainly, as soon as we hear of extra resources, we will share those. And it's always worth keeping in touch with Disability Sport Australia, Disability Sport and Recreation in Victoria, Sport for All. There's lots of organisations that are doing fantastic work, and Elle's been working on a specific project with VU, training, mentoring, and getting female athletes with a disability out into the community to coach all of us on how to be more inclusive, and that really important that the language and how we welcome people is crucial to them staying in our sporting clubs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Elle. I'm going to let you run, and I'm going to flip over to Sarah. Thanks, Elle. We will see you soon. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
My pleasure.
And I'll now whip over to the guru, Sarah Sterling from Volunteering Vic, who's going to take us through our session today. So we've got a few more hints on how, as an industry, we can support sport volunteers and keep them helping us produce some great opportunities for people. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Lisa. And I've just popped on to share my screen. So if you'll bear with me, I'll just pop the PowerPoints on because I don't love being front and center on camera. So first of all, I'd like to also acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which I am today, the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And, it's been fantastic to hear from Elle today about actually the personal experience that she had with volunteering. And as Lisa mentioned right at the start, this is a webinar that's part of a collaboration, extension of collaboration that Vicsport and Volunteering Victoria have undertaken to kind of, I guess, bridge the gaps between our sectors and really strengthen volunteering within the sports club, recognizing that, there's a lot of need, a lot of you who are working with clubs are recognizing that more and more we need volunteers to support what we do. So I'm going to talk through a little bit of the volunteering big picture and then focus specifically on the action cycle element for today, which was select. So recruiting, selecting the volunteers who will be in your club for particular roles, and we'll talk through some of those screening requirements and how to get volunteers into best fit roles. There will be time to answer questions at the end, so feel free to pop them in the chat, and if they are more appropriate for Lisa to answer from a sporting perspective, I know she'll jump in. But in terms of our bigger picture, we know that sport and volunteering are interlinked. There's it's no surprise to me that some of Elle's most vibrant sporting moments remember and recognise volunteers, because we know the community sport across the board could not happen without volunteers. They ensure activities of every sport, any size, at all levels, go ahead, are well run, are safe, accessible, and inclusive. So to make sure we have a healthy sporting culture in our nation, we have to make sure we have a healthy volunteering culture. We've got approximately 738,000 Victorians who volunteer in sport. It's a big number, but overall, volunteer numbers in sport are decreasing. Actually, volunteer numbers across the board are decreasing, and there was certainly a big decline over COVID. And probably a lot of you have actually popped onto this webinar thinking, gosh, our numbers are decreasing, and what can we do to assist with that boost? You know, there are a few strategies that we'll talk through today when it comes, you know, around the selection, but it's also just worth recognizing that you exist within a national context where everything, you know, volunteer numbers across the board are declining. So it's not necessarily something that just your club's doing, you're this anomaly. No, this is a trend across society. And, you know, Vicsport at Volunteering Victoria, we're here to try and help you boost your volunteer numbers. It's worth knowing that, you know, sport is, I think, one of the largest sectors. You know, we do a breakdown of sectors, and I think sport is almost the largest sector where the most Victorians volunteer. And yes, volunteer numbers really matter locally. So, you know, people on the call today are from a number of different organisations, but being in a sporting club typically means you're under-resourced, you're time poor, dependent on volunteers. And the aim of today is to help you gain the input, assistance and support of volunteers that you need. And I think it's worth noting that for a lot of clubs, this is in some ways not something people have ever had to think quite consciously about before, because often sporting clubs have been this really self-sustaining community. You know, your automatic volunteers are the parents or your wider community. And so this crisis in volunteering, which means that volunteer numbers are declining across the board, means that sporting clubs in particular are having to put a larger focus on trying to get volunteers through the doors to assist. And so we're looking at more diverse people. So focusing on select as a topic of the life cycle today is really, really important. So what Volunteering Victoria and Vicsport did when we collaborated on the life cycle model is to try and break down the big topic of volunteering into simpler, more accessible elements that you can particularly action within your club. There are club-specific resources that Lisa's mentioned that exist on our Volunteering Victoria website, and they're not going anywhere. And they're really, really useful and adaptable. So the idea is that you can download the resource and tailor it to your club. There's lots of templates, lots of policies, and they're broken down under each phase of the action life cycle. And then to particularly link sports clubs, it's been my observation since being in the volunteering sector that sports often exist within their own codes and haven't linked as traditionally with volunteering peak bodies and volunteering ecosystems. So it's really been a wonderful collaboration for us to link in more with different sporting codes, so we can share those knowledges across the different codes, but also across sectors, and then also create a sports industry grouping within our community here at Volunteering Victoria. And so to keep going with that knowledge sharing, we're going to, you know, hopefully run a couple more webinars this year just to keep building that connection and collaboration. So at Volunteering Victoria, we really talk about planning paying off. And there are lots of different life cycles, action cycles, but particularly for all the resources that we've created, we talk about planning, recruiting, selecting, guiding, encouraging, and recognizing. And so today, obviously, we're focusing on selecting, but it's worthwhile noticing that because the resources are broken down on our website in those 6 areas, you don't have to eat the whole elephant at once, you know, to fall back on an old adage. You can look at these things and think, gosh, actually, we really have to think about our selection processes. So we're going to focus on this area first. Or actually, our recognition processes, no one's thought about that for ages. So we're going to tackle this area. Because I think some of the complexity when it comes to volunteering is that you can think of it as too large a problem, so you don't just tackle some of those chunks. Hopefully the way the resources have been structured means they're very easy to chunk through and work through each area. as we said, select, and the focus of today's webinar is really about selecting the right volunteer for the skills that you need. So part of that is, identifying what skills are needed at each particular role. Then also helping to navigate the regulatory environment that we work in. So making sure that any checks or any screening processes, which is an essential part of Select, are undertaken, and that you have the facilities and the resources to make that as simple as possible, knowing that checks can feel like a whole world of their own, and all the different sporting codes and qualifications that are needed. You can feel quite lost navigating that. And all of this planning really is about reducing the risk of selecting someone who's not interested or appropriate in the role. And there's a number of reasons we really try and reduce that risk, because sometimes I think in volunteering, you can just think, oh, well, I need people. So it doesn't, what does it matter? But if you pop someone in a role who's not interested or not appropriate, first of all, you could risk, there's a real risk in terms of people's safety. If people aren't engaged, if people aren't undertaking the training, people aren't, sort of engaging with the seriousness of the role itself. But also that can affect your overall volunteering culture and morale. So, or the morale that you've had, which is that you've, gone through the whole process of planning, recruiting, and selecting someone, and then they leave fairly shortly because the role itself wasn't appropriate, or they weren't interested. That can certainly have a demoralizing effect when you've pumped a lot of resources into that recruitment process. So this process around selecting volunteers really is about ensuring longevity and making sure that there's a really great connection to volunteers and what they're doing. They get that fulfillment, and so they're more likely to stay and continue a connection. So I've touched on this a little already, but selecting gets the right recruits in the right places, and focusing on this is very important because it helps you articulate and successfully implement selection processes that you need in your club, gives you the confidence you're matching the right people for your available roles, lowers the risk of recruiting volunteers who may cause harm, as I was just chatting about a little bit, and it showcases your commitment to creating a great environment to volunteers. And so part of that is knowing the roles, part of that is getting to know the people through the selection process. And we'll talk about what tools are at your disposal. But it's really about ensuring that people want to stay and have a great experience volunteering, so they're more likely to come back and do it again. I often like to say, really wanting to encourage someone to become a lifelong volunteer. And at your club, you may actually have people who are happy to be in the same role for 20 years. I'm sure everyone has that type of person who's been showing up for 20 years doing exactly the same role. But more likely, now you're going to have people who flit in and out across the different stages of their life. I'm a harder person to capture being a busy parent myself than I was for volunteering. But thinking about the ways in which you can attract and keep people connected through the right volunteer roles increases your ability to maintain volunteers across the course of their life. So step one of the selecting the right resources is really about defining and implementing good selection processes. And again, apologies if some of this appears like I'm speaking about things that are fairly obvious, but when you're really, really busy and just responding, and again, focusing on just getting bums on seats, it can be easily overlooked. But overlooking some of these key steps around defining and what we need to do to implement really opens the club up and opens up the risk that you're going to end up recruiting the wrong person and suffer from all of those risks that we talked to before. So we recommend planning processes that include sort of detailing and setting up processes to ensure minimum selection requirements are met for all roles, whether it's an event or game day or governance focus, just so you don't have to think about it. You know, if you are sort of in a place where you need bums and seats, making sure that everyone who's sort of attached to the club, if you're focusing on juniors, has a working with children's club check, means that you're not necessarily going to have to think twice before scheduling someone into a particular role. So it removes an aspect of complexity. Then ensuring processes are easily accessible, easy to use, so they'll be followed. And again, we're looking at greater diversity within our clubs, within our volunteer organisations. So thinking about, are they easy to use for people who may not have English as, you know, their first background? You know, all of these things, there are often a lot of assumptions about what is easy. I realized my own assumptions when I tried to book an airline flight with my grandpa the other day on an iPad. But making sure that the processes and policies are easy to be followed will really help. Again, ensuring your club has a relevant sport code of conduct and child safe standards in place, which are two really, really key documents, both of which, because they can really, they're key tools that you can use if something goes wrong and someone's not a great fit for a role, you can talk to them, but also they ensure you're meeting the basic standards of safety for your club, particularly in terms of that child safe piece, but also making sure you're upholding your duties to everyone in terms of that basic code of conduct, and then updating volunteer details into your state sporting associations database. Again, those are those minimum compliance requirements. So again, once you're sort of starting to define those selection requirements by the need, think about it in terms of breaking down all roles at your club versus broader selection requirements that might just apply to certain roles. So, for example, all roles at your club, what are the minimum selection requirements to be met? And whether it's game day or event volunteers or more specific specialist positions such as coaches, administrative and governance volunteers, make sure that you're applying these selection steps consistently to all volunteers. And then if there are broader selection requirements for particular roles, governance roles or coaches roles, define those and categorize those roles where broader selection requirements need to be met. And you'll need to meet the minimum plus these requirements. Because again, it's about putting your processes in place to make it easy. Because you don't want to be having to remember that John Smith over there needs to submit his thing if he changes roles to do another thing. You want to make sure you have a sense of all requirements being ticked off so you can be confident to move volunteers around roles if you need, or, start putting people forward for additional requirements. And again, just a reminder, there's a link at the bottom of the slide to that volunteer sports toolkit, which has a lot of the tools and systems that can help support this. So looking at those selection requirements by need, minimum requirements that should really apply to all roles at clubs are things like background checks, so having a proof of identity for individuals, and reference checks, so being able to talk to their character. A lot of people say 2 minimum. Any qualification checks, if appropriate, when it comes to coaching or, governance requirements, and then a working with children check or equivalent. So we get asked a lot whether VIT cards, like Teachers Institute cards, can substitute for working with children check, and that's probably what I'd talk to as the equivalent, because there's a working with children check built into that check. And then a police check if applicable. And noting that, police check is often one of the more optional of roles. It's not necessary, it's not mandated, it's legislative. So working with children check, there's absolutely no wiggle room there. Like anyone who's working with children or in contact with children would need to have one of those, whereas police check, it might be more dependent on the role. You might want to, if someone's doing volunteer driving for sport, we'd recommend possibly putting in a police check around being able to check whether there were driving offences. So it has that potential to be a little more role dependent, and then a code of conduct completion. So that's really important in terms of setting up expectations of behaviour and being able to say, if someone stepped outside the bounds of appropriate behaviour, to have something to come back to that says, hey, you agreed to this, this is the expectation. So it doesn't become a personal criticism. It's a really, really helpful tool. And quite often things like code of conduct completion or a volunteer signing off on a position description or role description, they can get overlooked as like, oh, that's administrative overhead. But remember that as part of the selection process, what you're actually doing is making sure there's a shared expectation about what's required for the role, and having something concrete that you can look at and say, hey, yeah, we spoke about this, we agreed on this, this is how we're going to behave, because it gives you something to come back to. And so then broader requirements that you might have for, you know, more specific roles such as coaches, administrators, governance roles, so people on your board, you might actually find it appropriate to go through a particular interview process for that role, saying, is there a best fit? You might use that position description requirement, or you know, use that opportunity to talk through expectations to make sure there's a shared expectation. You'd have your background checks that you'd apply to all roles anyway, but you might also have qualification checks specific to a role, 2 or 3 reference checks. And again, it's going to be role dependent, but you know, you can actually get a driver's history check that's different even from a police check that's specific to a volunteer driver. That might be an appropriate check, or you might have a police check for your board treasurer. Those are the types of things that you might consider in terms of qualification checks. For sports, you'd probably want to make sure their coaching qualifications are up to date and relevant. And I'm going to admit that, Lisa, that's an entire area of navigation that if anyone has more technical questions on, I'm going to defer to you. But also having a couple of referee checks is really, really important. And I can see that there are a couple of comments, at least in the chat, which I haven't had a look at, but we'll come back to those at the end. And we don't have too much longer to go, so thank you for bearing with me. But yes, managing the selection requirements across the club, you know, consistency comes from accessibility. So making sure that, you know, you have your systems in place to make it as easy as possible. Create checklists of your minimum and broader requirements, and make sure that as you're processing your volunteers, you're actually able to say, yep, done this, done that, done that, done that. It provides clarity and ensures the requirements are completed. It also means that if, say, for some reason, someone else has to pick up your duties at the club, you're able to pass that on really easily, and not all the information is living in your head. You know, I think quite often people in organisations, sometimes the complexity around volunteering at organisations or smaller organisations, clubs and groups in particular, is that a lot of information lives in the heads of the people who've been in leadership and running the organisation for a long time. And so it means it's harder for people to step in and take small amounts of work off them, and the roles become bigger and bigger and more centralised. And so even though sometimes it can feel like it's a bit more work to create checklists, to, you know, put systems and processes in place, what it enables you to do is pass these things on easier and, you know, share the workload easier, which in an environment where, you know, there's smaller numbers of volunteers and volunteers are all feeling more overloaded, being able to chunk work is really, really important to relieve that sort of personal burnout that a lot of clubs are experiencing. Make sure that code of conduct requirements are current and accessible. You know, it might be a good idea to ask your volunteers to renew that every 6 months or every month. And that's just a clear mechanism for volunteers to acknowledge their understanding. And again, it's about that shared expectation setting. And I cannot tell you, you know, we've run training on how to have difficult conversations with volunteers, and time again, a lot of the complications that come up with volunteers is that shared expectation hasn't been built at the start, and a problem's allowed to fester. But having that code of conduct that's really, really clear on behaviour expectations is so important. And then make sure you centrally file. So make sure the documents you need are completed by volunteers, and any documents you need to receive from volunteers. So again, that test of, if I were to disappear tomorrow, how would anyone know what is going on? Again, provide those clear instructions for ease of application process, and explain how your club uses and manages any information gained through interviews and background checks. So just making sure that that's a bit secure, recognizing that we live in a world where privacy and security is pretty important. So that might be a password protected file. It might be, a bunch of other mechanisms, but just making sure that, you're not treating that information lightly, because volunteers will appreciate knowing that. And then again, update volunteers into your state sporting associations database if applicable. Really, what I want to emphasize from this is that communication is key. So, making sure that you respect all applicants by advising if they're successful or not. That demonstrates your club's commitment to a great environment for volunteers, but it reduces the likelihood of problems later on. I really think communication is so vital to creating a wonderful volunteer team and environment. And again, making sure that you can look laterally if for some reason a coaching role or a board role isn't going to work for someone and that's what they put their hand up for. There might be a role in the club which is a better fit for them. And making sure that you have that communication right from the start, and you're transparent and open about that, opens that bridge up for the opportunity for other roles to be filled. When you're talking about time commitment roles, like I said, I think a little earlier on, I'm an incredibly hard person to get to volunteer because my time is limited, but keeping that communication open to say, hey, I want to, or if you're interested, stay in touch with us. That's a fantastic way to build a really responsive and open and hopefully more diverse community. And as I said, sort of keep that door open. Great volunteers are gold. And it may mean that if someone steps away, they might not come back to you until 2 or 3 years. But if you keep people involved via a mailing list or keep reaching out every now and then, chances are you're more likely to see people return. So, without, bearing in mind that we have an hour to talk through a fairly complex topic, really wanting to remind you, in particular, when it comes to selection, it's a really actually important part of managing risk at your club. And even though, again, sometimes those organisational drivers really can motivate you to just fill bums on seats, the risks of bringing in the wrong person without the right skills for the role that you need are huge. And you risk bringing in volunteers who lack interest in the role which you want them to fill, and that may reduce morale. And ultimately, unfortunately, the risk that a volunteer may cause harm. And so planning that selection process allows you to easily articulate and implement the steps needed in your club for that successful recruitment. So I'll probably pause there and stop sharing my screen. I have tried to pack a lot of information in quite quickly. And I'll now just have a look at some of those chat questions and open up. So yeah, Dale, really value your suggestion there that treasurers get a police check in case of fraud. It's a really, really important point. Again, it comes down to specifying, making sure that the type of check is fit for purpose for the role. Sometimes we find in our world of checks, we go overboard and say every role has to have every single check, but that can be an unconscious barrier for a lot of different positions. So recognizing which roles checks are important for and which roles actually we've got enough mechanisms in place to safeguard that particular role. I wouldn't say you need a police check, to assist on a game day. for example, but it's entirely appropriate when it comes to that treasurer's role to mandate a police check. So just like to encourage any other questions from anyone else online, questions for myself, or I'll put Lisa in the hotspot as well. If you have any things you want to talk about. As I said, those resources are free and available via Volunteering Victoria's website. We also have an info at, like an email line, an info at, and a reception number. And Gillian, I might get you to just drop those into the chat, where we have staff available and responding if you have any questions, if you're looking for a resource. Our staff generally are available and really willing to assist any organisation throughout the state. If you have any questions about volunteering specifically, you can subscribe to our newsletter where opportunities like this are flagged. We're also, I'm going to shamelessly plug, we have a conference that we're running in June. That may not be for everyone in terms of certainly a time investment, but one of the wonderful things about conferences that we at VV run is you not only get the diversity of different, say, sporting codes, but you get that diversity of different sectors. So there are tactics that emergency management volunteers, environmental volunteers, education-based volunteers are all confronting, because, as I said, the challenges across the volunteering sector, they're both complex and interrelated, but sharing some of that knowledge across sectors provides some of the most valuable learning that we, are able to facilitate at Volunteering Victoria. So if you're able to and interested, there's information about that on our website. Just do another call out. For any other questions there. I can see that Ben has written in to say another thing to consider is that if volunteers are required to pay for their police check, a plan should be in place to support volunteers who can't afford to pay for the check. For example, offering to pay for the check for volunteers who are facing financial hardship, and makes a point around, even though it's the volunteer police check is a reduced fee, it can still be a barrier. And that is absolutely a really, really important point to highlight, Ben, and really, really crucial. And I think making sure you think through all of these processes, both in terms of the administration and forms and checklists, but also making sure in your conversations about forms, you have lines like that to say, hey, let us know if you are experiencing financial hardship so we can assist you. We don't want this to be a barrier. Those are really, really important things to flag so individuals don't self-select out before you even get them through the door. We know that cost of living and those challenges, again, another great resource, and I'll put you on the hotspot, Gillian, to pop a link in, is we did a state of volunteering report in 2020, which identified some terrible statistic around it costs volunteers about $6.70 to volunteer an hour to volunteer. And so as organisations, working out ways that you can support reducing some of those hidden costs around transport, around checks and requirements, those things are really, really important to think about when you're undertaking selection as an organisation. And yeah, I'll get Gillian to pop that link in the chat, because it's, for anyone who hasn't come across that report, is a fantastic read. It's very interesting, lots of insights about what volunteering looks like in Victoria. And it's quite unique because a lot of the information that we have on volunteering comes from the census, but in the census, there's just one question. So, we really have just a limited amount of information, whereas the state of volunteering delved into an organisation, individual perspective, and it tried to do a lot of that valuation of, put a monetary value on volunteers' contribution and time, really, there are some wonderful insights. So I've just seen the question from Annabelle around what sort of specific consulting, individual support or advice can Volunteering Victoria provide sporting clubs that are struggling to recruit volunteers. Look, honestly, it is in the context of a lot of organisations are struggling to recruit volunteers. What I always do when I'm training or engaging with organisations is get people to do, I guess, a bit of a sphere of influence map and look at their local communities, look at places where it's possible, say, to build partnerships. Because as I said, some of those traditional communities, parents, people, community groups that people may have relied on in the past, if they're unable to be accessed anymore or the numbers are declining, are there any other community groups that you can partner with, such as local schools or local university students? University students are a really, really great source of individuals who are quite keen to volunteer and get experience. So trying to think about developing partnerships is a really good one. Also, when we go back to our statistics, and this is why I say the State of Volunteering report is a really, really insightful read, is that despite all of our fancy volunteer information and advertising platforms, actually the most common way individuals hear about their volunteer roles is by word of mouth. So in some ways, one of the best ways that you can invest in positive recruitment is having a really great reputation and making your volunteer experience as fun as possible, because your volunteers are going to go out and tell their friends or their communities to come out and volunteer if they have a good experience with you. So having, initiatives where you actually capitalize on those personal networks as well, having Bring a Friend Day, to volunteer, or, encouraging events where people are utilizing those personal networks. There's any number of volunteer platforms where you can advertise for volunteer roles, and a lot of clubs, organizations have limited success with those. And again, what I would say, if you're using one of those platforms, is think about how to frame up those advertisements, frame up those position descriptions, roles. Really think about how you're communicating what you need. Quite often, we'll have conversations with clubs and they say, "Oh, we just need volunteers," and that's what's advertised. Making sure you're saying, "We need a specific role," rather than just a general call out for volunteers. There's also, Gillian's quite rightly popped, we work in partnership across regions with consortiums as part of one of our federal volunteering programs, and we've got case studies from each of the local regions, and there's 8 regions across Victoria, and there's a lead that you can reach out to for some more localized, tailored advice. But Gillian's popped some resources from that case studies page on the chat as well. I'm just having a look at Amy's question there. So hopefully that's given you a few other ideas, Annabelle, but again, would encourage you to email the team or come and chat to anyone, to have a bit of a sounding board of support, or reach out to someone in your local area. I'm not sure exactly where you're based, but those consortiums can provide support and advice to you guys. Is there any movement going on? Volunteering Victoria are going to look at, with the fair access policies coming into place, and how to help sports clubs through that. Clubs are seeing it as more work to get more women and girls involved in communities, coaching players, but wanted to see if there's been discussions in this place.
Probably not.
It's not a specific, I was going to say, it's not a specific focus of VV at this point, but Lisa, I might defer to you if you have any other comments specifically around that fair access policies, and how it might be affecting sporting clubs.
Yeah, look, it's hello, Amy. Thank you for that question. So for those of you that don't know, there's a policy being rolled out across Victorian government to make sure that facilities are only rented out to sporting clubs from LGAs, and those sporting clubs need to, by a certain date, middle of this year, make sure that they've got teams of women using facilities across those facilities from LGAs. So there is a need, as Amy's pointed out, to obviously encourage more women to be involved in playing sport, in administering sport, volunteering across the board. So There's been some sessions that Office for Women's Sport and Recreation have run. There's been lots of sessions that Megan and her team at Regional Sport Vic have run across trying to support LGAs and sports to be up to date on this policy. But obviously it's something that we can look at as well in conjunction with VV in terms of thinking about what else can we do specifically to help with that question, because it is quite niche. Other things, if you have a look at the recruit resources that are associated with this package that we've worked on with VV and SRV and Regional Sport Vic, there's some hints about how to recruit more people, and also, seek volunteer. Sports people have a volunteering section, and as Sarah said, the universities, those uni students doing sports management degrees are really keen to volunteer because it's really the only way they're going to nail their first job in sport. But as we said, we've traditionally lent on parents or people that have played our sports before, who are hanging around waiting for family members to finish playing sport and they're volunteer at the time. But there's other people in community that could well be interested. So community newsletters, LGA newsletters, getting to local people that might be retired and want to spend some time in a club. But as Sarah pointed out, make sure that the ad is not, oh, by the way, come along to athletics and spend 10 hours on the track in the sun and do 1,000 jobs. Try to divide up those jobs. Try to be specific about what the jobs are so that people think, oh, I could do that. I'm happy to, put in a couple of hours, rather than overwhelming them with too much in that ad when you're trying to recruit people. Really important.
But also I would say, remember, particularly when you're starting to dive outside your natural community or cohort, which is parents of kids, make sure you try and remove the jargon. And I will self-acknowledge that it's, I've never been involved in a sporting club. So the amount of acronyms and, sort of assumptions that you can make around sporting clubs, assume knowledge, can sometimes be a barrier in its own right. So just making sure you think through how you're communicating things and not assuming, hey, you know this or you know this code or, some of that, particularly when you're recruiting volunteers from new sources, is really, really important to, again, retaining them and keeping them engaged.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah. I don't think we've got any more. One question from Janetta: for volunteer position description roles, do you have templates? Yeah, there is templates as part of the resources for PDs that you can just print out and modify. So have a look, jump into the Volunteering Victoria website. If you can't find it, jump onto the Vicsport website, go to Sport Volunteers, and we'll click through to Volunteering Vic. But it's pretty easy to find on the VV website, Volunteers and Sport. And there's lots of pro formas there that you can just use and pop your own club or sport name and logo or whatever you want to add to those. We've tried to make it as user-friendly as possible, and to cut down the amount of time that you as sports administrators and or volunteers have to spend on that. And Sally's got a good idea. Volunteer day can be a good idea. I find that at my particular club, I'm involved in an athletics club, just actually asking people face-to-face. Often we don't do that. We advertise and we pop it on the Facebook site. We say, oh, we need people. But if you just say to people, look, we really need your help. Could you give us 2 hours on this day doing this? We often don't do that. And I find particularly for people that are probably a bit nervous about volunteering and feel like they haven't done it before or they're not an expert in the sport, their child's a participant. If they're asked face-to-face, shown what they would be doing, and it's a limited hours that's kind of under control, then we find that we get more people kind of jumping the fence and helping out on the track or behind the scenes. So that's often something that we kind of forget about when we're thinking about recruiting new people, and then obviously putting the practices of selecting them properly into play. And we've got to be careful, as Sarah so well pointed out, we want more volunteers, and people might come and say, oh, I'll do it, but we then need to make sure that we are selecting them and checking them properly so that we avoid any issues down the track of people not being the right type of person, not being a good fit for that particular role, and just make sure we've got those checks in place as we go along. So thank you, Sarah. That was awesome. I think we've run out of questions. Gillian's just put a reminder that the session has been recorded. You will get some information afterwards so you can pass on to to other colleagues and stakeholders within your sports. But we really appreciate Volunteering Victoria's work on this. Thank you, Gillian, in the background. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. And we're here to support. Any questions, please, as Sarah said, jump into the VV site or come onto Vicsport and we can pass you on to the right people. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you out there on sports fields soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.
Have a great day.